April 1962. A rice paddy near Bac Lieu, South Vietnam. Nguyen Van Thanh crouches in the tree line, watching something he's never seen before. A helicopter, American, flying low over the paddy, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades echoing across the water. The machine hovers, nose dipping slightly, then lands in the field. Soldiers pour out. South Vietnamese troops, ARVN. They spread out, begin searching the village. Thanh watches with curiosity, not fear. He's a Viet Cong cadre, been fighting since the French days. He's seen helicopters before, French H-21s. Big, slow, loud, easy to avoid, easy to shoot down if you had to. This American helicopter looks even more fragile. A bubble of glass and thin metal. No armor he can see. The whole thing shakes when it sits on the ground. Looks like it might fall apart. His squad leader, older, more experienced, spits in the dirt. The Americans send toys to fight a war, he says. Glass helicopters that will shatter when we shoot them. Let them come. We'll fill the sky with their wreckage. The other fighters laugh, nod in agreement. They've ambushed ARVN units before, killed soldiers, captured weapons. The helicopters are just another target, slower than a man running through jungle, louder than a buffalo. How hard could it be? Thanh raises his rifle. It's an old French MAS-36. Bolt action, 5 rounds. He could hit that helicopter from here, easy shot. But the order hasn't been given. They're here to observe, not engage. The helicopter lifts off, banks away, disappears over the tree line. Within 3 years, Thanh will be dead, killed by fire from a helicopter he never saw. Never heard until the rockets were already impacting. His squad will be scattered. His entire battalion will learn to fear the sound of rotor blades more than anything else in the war, because that fragile-looking machine, that glass bubble the Viet Cong laughed at, would become the most revolutionary weapon system in modern warfare. It would turn the jungle from Viet Cong sanctuary into a free fire zone. It would make distance meaningless and concealment worthless. It would change everything about how wars were fought. The UH-1 Iroquois. Everyone called it the Huey. And by the time the Viet Cong understood what it really was, it was already too late. The sky belonged to America, and from the sky came death faster than anyone could run. In 1961, the United States military faced a problem in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong were winning. Not through conventional battles, through mobility. They'd strike a village, kill the defenders, seize weapons, and disappear into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. The South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, couldn't respond fast enough. They'd get word of an attack, load soldiers into trucks, drive to the location. Takes hours. By the time they arrived, the Viet Cong were gone. Vanished into the jungle or underground. No one to fight. Just dead bodies and burned villages. The Viet Cong controlled the tempo. They chose when to fight, where to fight. And they always had escape routes planned. The ARVN were always reacting, always late, always chasing ghosts. The French had faced the same problem during the Indochina War. They tried using helicopters. The H-21 Shawnee, big twin-rotor transport helicopter, could carry troops. But it was slow. Maximum speed 127 miles per hour. Cruise speed much slower. It was loud. You could hear it coming from miles away. And it was vulnerable. The Viet Minh had shot down dozens of them. The American advisors in 1961 knew they needed something different. Something faster. Something that could get troops to a fight before the enemy scattered. something that could change the equation. The answer was already in production. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, first flown in 1956, designed as a medical evacuation helicopter, simple, reliable, fast. The Army ordered hundreds of them, but nobody had really figured out how to use them for combat yet. In December 1961, the first UH-1As arrived in Vietnam, part of Operation Chopper. The plan was simple: use helicopters to transport ARVN troops rapidly to combat zones. Cut response time from hours to minutes. Give the South Vietnamese the mobility advantage. The first combat air assault happened on December 23, 1961. 32 soldiers of the ARVN 7th Infantry Division, loaded into UH-1s at Saigon, flew to a suspected Viet Cong position near the Cambodian border. The helicopters landed. Troops jumped out, spread out to search. The Viet Cong had already left. The assault found nothing, but it proved the concept worked. You could move a platoon of soldiers 100 miles in under an hour. That was revolutionary. The Viet Cong noticed. But they weren't worried. Not yet. The early UH-1As were limited. They could carry 6 soldiers and crew, had a 770 shaft horsepower Lycoming T-53 engine. Not a lot of power. In the heat and humidity of Vietnam, performance suffered. They struggled to hover with full loads, couldn't climb quickly, were vulnerable during landing and takeoff. And they were unarmed, completely unarmed. The UH-1A was a transport helicopter. It had no weapons, no machine guns, no rockets, nothing. If you took fire while landing, your only option was to take the hits and hope nothing critical got damaged. The Viet Cong learned this quickly. They'd watch helicopters land, wait until soldiers were getting out, then open fire. The helicopters were sitting ducks, couldn't maneuver on the ground, couldn't shoot back. Just had to sit there and take it while soldiers scrambled for cover. In the first 6 months of 1962, several UH-1s were shot down. Many more were damaged. The Americans learned a brutal lesson. Undefended helicopters were death traps in combat zones. The solution came from the crews themselves. Field modifications. Door gunners. They mounted M60 machine guns on the doors. Nothing official. No authorization. Just survival. A crew chief would stand in the door with an M60 on a bungee cord. Provide suppressing fire during landing and takeoff. It helped. But it wasn't enough. The M60 was a 7.62 millimeter machine gun. Good for suppressing infantry. But it couldn't destroy fortified positions. Couldn't take out bunkers. Couldn't provide real fire support. The Army started developing armed helicopter variants. The UH-1B came with more power, 960 shaft horsepower, better performance, and it could be fitted with weapons, rocket pods, 2.75-inch rockets, multiple machine guns, even grenade launchers. By 1963, the concept of the helicopter gunship was born. Dedicated attack helicopters that would escort the transports, suppress enemy fire, provide fire support. The Viet Cong called them devil birds. The Americans called them hogs or frogs, depending on their loadout. The UH-1C came next. Even more power, 1,100 shaft horsepower, better weapons systems, could carry 48 rockets plus machine guns. The gunships became legitimate weapons platforms, not just defensive, but offensive. And the Viet Cong were starting to realize their mistake. These weren't fragile toys anymore. These were flying artillery platforms that could appear without warning and unleash devastating firepower. But they still believed they could adapt. Still believed the jungle would protect them. Still believed American technology couldn't overcome Vietnamese determination and jungle warfare expertise. They were wrong. The transformation of the Huey from transport to weapon system happened fast. Too fast for the Viet Cong to counter effectively. The tactics evolved through trial and error. And blood. Lots of blood. American pilots learned what worked and what got you killed. The knowledge spread through the helicopter units. The combat assault became a choreographed operation. Multiple helicopters working together. Gunships and transports in coordination. The goal was to put maximum soldiers on the ground, in minimum time, with maximum fire support. A typical assault would work like this. Intelligence identifies a suspected Viet Cong location. Could be a village, a jungle base, a supply cache. The assault force loads up. Transport helicopters, called slicks because they didn't carry external weapons, would load soldiers. 8 to 10 per helicopter depending on model and conditions. Could be a platoon spread across 3 helicopters. Could be a company across 10 or more. The gunships would load up with maximum weapons. Rockets, machine guns, grenades, whatever they could carry. The formation would take off. Gunships in front and on the flanks, transports in the middle. Flying low, using terrain for concealment when possible. But mostly just accepting that everyone would hear them coming. And that was the paradox. Helicopters were loud, incredibly loud. The whop-whop-whop of the rotors, the whine of the turbine, you could hear them from miles away. There was no stealth, no surprise. Everyone knew you were coming. But it didn't matter. Because by the time they heard you, you were already there. The speed was the surprise. Viet Cong units would hear helicopters, start to retreat. But before they could scatter, the helicopters were overhead, landing, disgorging troops. You couldn't run fast enough. The final approach was when it got dangerous. Coming into a landing zone. LZ could be a clearing, could be a rice paddy, could be anywhere relatively flat. The helicopters would descend from altitude. Gunships would go in first, make a gun run. Rockets and machine gun fire saturating the tree line around the LZ, suppressing any enemy. 48 rockets from one gunship, multiple gunships. That's hundreds of rockets impacting in seconds. Anyone in those tree lines was dead or keeping their head down. Then the slicks would come in, fast, nose up, flare to kill forward speed, touchdown. Soldiers out both sides. The helicopter would be on the ground for 15 to 30 seconds max. Get the soldiers out. Lift off immediately. Get out of the danger zone. Staying on the ground was death. If the Viet Cong had time to aim, if they had heavy weapons, if they'd prepared for a helicopter assault. A helicopter on the ground was a target. A helicopter in the air was harder to hit. The gunships would orbit overhead, provide cover. If the landing troops took fire, the gunships would attack the source. Rockets, machine guns, suppressing fire. The door gunners on the slicks would also fire if they could identify targets. The entire assault from first helicopter arriving to last soldier on the ground could take less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to put 100 soldiers into a combat zone. That was a capability that had never existed before in warfare. The Viet Cong had no doctrine for dealing with it. They'd developed tactics for dealing with slow-moving ground forces. They knew how to set ambushes on roads, how to attack convoys, how to use the jungle for concealment and escape. But helicopters bypassed all of that. There were no roads to ambush. The jungle didn't provide concealment from above. You couldn't hide from helicopters. and scattering took time. Time you didn't have when soldiers were landing on top of you. The psychological impact was severe. Viet Cong units would be in their base camps, hidden, secure. Suddenly helicopters overhead, rockets impacting, explosions everywhere. Then American and ARVN soldiers pouring out of helicopters. Before you could process what was happening, you were in a firefight. And if you tried to run, the gunships would get you. They'd see you running through the jungle, see you running across rice paddies. The door gunners would track you, fire. You'd go down. Or the pilots would fire rockets. 2.75-inch rockets, high explosive warheads. They didn't have to hit you directly. Close was good enough. The Viet Cong started calling the Hueys dragons, said they breathed fire and brought death from the sky. The psychological warfare value was enormous. Villages that heard helicopters coming knew what was about to happen. Anyone supporting the Viet Cong would scatter, hide, hope they weren't the target. By 1964, the Huey was dominating the battlefield. The Americans were conducting hundreds of air assault operations every month. The Viet Cong were forced to adapt their entire operational concept. They couldn't mass forces anymore, couldn't maintain large base camps, couldn't move during the day. Everything had to be dispersed. Everything had to be hidden underground or under triple canopy jungle. Everything had to happen at night. The kill ratios were devastating. In air assault operations, the Americans would typically suffer light casualties while inflicting heavy casualties on the Viet Cong. Because the Viet Cong couldn't prepare, couldn't choose the battlefield, couldn't escape easily. They were reacting, always reacting. And in combat, the side that's reacting is usually the side that's losing. The Viet Cong tried to fight back. They developed tactics specifically for dealing with helicopters. But everything they tried had problems. The most obvious counter was anti-aircraft fire. Shoot down the helicopters before they can land. Simple in theory, difficult in practice. The Viet Cong and NVA had anti-aircraft weapons, not sophisticated systems, mostly heavy machine guns, DSHK 12.7mm machine guns, Chinese Type 54, Soviet DSHK 38. These were the same weapons used against aircraft in World War II and Korea. Effective range about 1,500 meters. Effective ceiling about 1,000 meters. They also had smaller weapons, AK-47s, SKS rifles, even bolt-action rifles. Anything that could shoot could potentially hit a helicopter. And sometimes they did. Volume of fire mattered. If enough people shot at a helicopter, someone would hit something critical. The problem was exposure. To shoot at a helicopter, you had to expose your position. You had to be above ground, visible. And the minute you opened fire, every gunship in the area would focus on you. Viet Cong anti-aircraft gunners had a life expectancy measured in minutes during air assaults. They'd hear helicopters coming, set up their heavy machine gun, maybe get off a burst or two. Then rockets would impact their position, or door gunners would suppress them. The gunners would die. The gun would be captured or destroyed. It was a trade. Sacrifice the anti-aircraft position to maybe damage a helicopter. Sometimes it worked. A burst of 12.7mm rounds into an engine would bring down a Huey. A lucky hit on the tail rotor. A hit that killed the pilot. These things happened. Helicopters were shot down regularly. But the trade-off wasn't favorable for the Viet Cong. They'd lose gunners faster than they could replace them. They'd lose weapons. And the helicopters kept coming. For every Huey shot down, 3 more would arrive. The Americans had hundreds of helicopters. The Viet Cong had limited anti-aircraft weapons and limited gunners trained to use them. The Viet Cong tried setting up ambushes at landing zones. If they knew a specific LZ was being used regularly, they'd prepare positions around it, dig trenches, build bunkers, pre-sight weapons, wait for helicopters to land. Sometimes this worked. Helicopters would land in a hot LZ, take heavy fire. Soldiers would get hit as they exited. Some helicopters would be damaged before they could take off. It was brutal. But the Americans adapted. They stopped using the same LZs repeatedly. They'd alternate, use different LZs for each operation, or they'd use artillery and airstrikes to prep the LZ before landing, saturate the area with fire, then land. Anything that survived the prep fire would be suppressed enough that the landing was safer. And if an LZ was hot, the gunships would focus all fire on it. The volume of firepower from multiple gunships was overwhelming. Bunkers would be destroyed. Tree lines would be shredded. The Viet Cong learned that defending an LZ meant dying in that LZ. The Viet Cong tried mobile tactics. Don't defend the LZ. Let the helicopters land. Let the soldiers deploy. Then attack them once they're spread out, away from helicopter support. In the jungle where helicopters can't see you, this worked better. The helicopters would leave after dropping off troops. The soldiers would move into the jungle. Then the Viet Cong would hit them. Ambush, use the terrain. The Americans would take casualties, call for extraction. Sometimes the extraction would be contested. But this tactic had limits. The Americans could call in artillery, airstrikes, and helicopter gunships would return quickly. If your ambush took too long, gunships would arrive and turn it into a slaughter. You had maybe 10 or 15 minutes to hit Americans and escape before the helicopters came back. And helicopters meant immediate medevac. An American soldier would get shot. His unit would call for medevac. A Huey, configured as a dust-off, medical evacuation helicopter, would arrive in minutes. The wounded soldier would be in a field hospital within 30 minutes of being hit. The survival rate for wounded Americans in Vietnam was the highest in any war in history. Because of helicopters. Because medevac was that fast. The Viet Cong didn't have that. If you got hit, you'd be carried by your comrades. Maybe to a field hospital. Maybe just to a hiding place. Medical care was primitive. If you got seriously wounded, you probably died. Or you were crippled for life. This created another advantage for Americans. Soldiers knew that if they got hit, they'd probably survive. Medevac would come. This reduced fear, increased morale, made soldiers more willing to fight aggressively. The Viet Cong knew that getting hit meant probable death. This made them more cautious, more focused on escape and survival than victory. The psychological difference mattered. By 1965, the Viet Cong had largely given up on defeating helicopters directly. The new strategy was avoidance. Here, helicopters, hide or run. Don't engage unless forced to. Preserve forces. Accept that Americans could move quickly and strike anywhere. Adapt operations to account for this. The Viet Cong shifted to smaller units, dispersed operations, less reliance on base camps, more emphasis on tunnel systems and underground shelters. Avoid detection from the air. Avoid giving helicopters targets. This worked to an extent. American air assaults would land in areas and find nothing. The Viet Cong had scattered, gone underground, hidden. The operation would find empty jungle, maybe a few stragglers. But the main force would be gone. But this defensive posture meant the Viet Cong couldn't conduct large operations. couldn't mass forces for major attacks, couldn't hold territory. They'd been forced into a permanent defensive crouch by helicopters. The initiative belonged to the Americans. The Battle of Viet Cong in November 1965 showed both the power of helicopter warfare and its limits. The first major conventional battle between American forces and the North Vietnamese Army. The 1st Cavalry Division, fully air mobile, was designed around helicopter operations. Every soldier, every weapon, every supply item would move by helicopter. No roads needed. No ground convoy vulnerable to ambush. Pure air mobility. On November 14, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Air, assaulted into Landing Zone X-ray in the Viet Cong Valley. 16 UH-1D helicopters, 8 soldiers per helicopter in the first lift, 128 men on the ground in the first wave. The LZ was hot from the start. NVA soldiers in the tree line opened fire immediately. Americans took casualties before the first helicopter lifted off. More helicopters came in, dropped more troops, took fire. Some helicopters were damaged, but the air assault continued. Moore got his entire battalion on the ground, over 400 soldiers. The helicopters kept coming, bringing ammunition, water, medical supplies, taking out wounded. The NVA attacked in waves, trying to overrun the American position before it could be reinforced. The Americans held, barely, called in artillery, airstrikes, and helicopter gunships. The gunships made the difference. UH-1C gunships armed with rockets and machine guns. They orbited overhead, attacked NVA positions in the tree line, suppressed enemy attacks, broke up assaults before they could reach American lines. The battle lasted 3 days. Americans suffered 79 killed, 121 wounded. The NVA lost an estimated 634 killed, probably more. The Americans held the LZ, extracted by helicopter when ordered to move to another objective. Viet Cong proved that air mobility worked, that helicopters could put soldiers anywhere, could sustain them in combat, could provide fire support, could evacuate wounded, could resupply continuously. The entire battle was enabled by helicopters. Without them, the battle couldn't have happened. But it also showed the limitations. Helicopters were vulnerable. Several were shot down. Many were damaged. LZS could be defended if the enemy was determined. Americans took casualties. The lessons from Viet Cong were incorporated into doctrine. Use artillery prep fire before landing. Use more gunships for suppression. Develop better intelligence on LZ conditions. Improve coordination between helicopters and ground forces. And keep building more helicopters. The answer to every problem was more helicopters, more mobility, more firepower, more everywhere-at-once capability. By 1966, the Huey had become the symbol of the American war effort. Iconic. The sound of Vietnam was rotor blades. The image of Vietnam was Hueys landing in rice paddies with soldiers jumping out. The smell of Vietnam was aviation fuel and jungle and fear. Over 7,000 UH-1 helicopters were deployed to Vietnam during the war, more than any other aircraft type. They flew millions of missions, transported millions of soldiers, evacuated over 900,000 wounded, conducted thousands of air assaults, supported every major operation. The statistics are staggering. At peak deployment, there were over 2,000 helicopters in Vietnam at any given time. The 1st Cavalry Division alone had over 400 helicopters. More helicopters than most countries had in their entire military. Helicopter pilots flew constantly. It wasn't unusual to fly 100 hours per month. Some pilots flew more, mission after mission, day after day. Combat assaults, resupply missions, medevac, reconnaissance, command and control, whatever was needed. The loss rate was high. 5,086 helicopters were destroyed in Vietnam. Not all combat losses. Many were operational accidents, mechanical failures, crashes during bad weather, pilot error. But combat losses were significant. The Viet Cong and NVA shot down hundreds of helicopters. Helicopter pilots had one of the most dangerous jobs in Vietnam. Flying helicopters into hot LZs repeatedly was psychologically exhausting. Every mission could be the one where you get shot down, where you take a round through the cockpit, where your engine quits and you auto-rotate into the jungle. Door gunners had it worse in some ways. Standing in the open door, exposed, no armor between them and the ground fire. Just strapped in with a monkey harness and holding an M60. Fire discipline was important. You couldn't just spray bullets everywhere. You had to identify targets, engage threats, conserve ammunition. Many door gunners were young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Some made it through their entire tour. Some died on their first mission. The randomness was maddening. But the Huey crews kept flying because they knew they were the difference. They were saving lives. Every medevac mission saved soldiers who would have died. Every resupply mission kept units in the fight. Every air assault mission gave Americans tactical advantage. They were critical, and they knew it. The maintenance crews worked miracles. Keeping helicopters flying in jungle conditions was a nightmare. Sand, dust, humidity, salt air near the coast, everything corroded. Everything wore out faster than it should. A helicopter would come back from a mission. Bullet holes in the skin, hydraulic fluid leaking, warning lights on. The maintenance crew would patch it, fix what could be fixed quickly, sign it off as mission capable, send it back out. They called it Band-Aid maintenance. Fix the critical stuff. Defer the rest. Because they needed every helicopter in the air. The demand was infinite. There were never enough helicopters, never enough pilots, never enough time. The evolution of the Huey continued throughout the war. New models, better engines, improved systems. The UH-1H became the standard model by 1967, 1,400 shaft horsepower. Could carry more soldiers, more weapons. Better performance in hot conditions. The weapon systems improved. The XM-21 armament system for gunships, minigun pods, 7.6 2mm miniguns, rate of fire 2,000 to 4,000 rounds per minute, devastating suppressive fire. A 3-second burst from a minigun would put 200 to 400 rounds into a target area. Nothing survived that. The rocket systems improved. Better targeting, better warheads. The 2.75-inch rockets became incredibly accurate. Gunship pilots could put rockets into windows, into bunker apertures. Precision fire from a moving helicopter. Some pilots became legends. Warrant officers with thousands of flight hours, multiple tours, awards for valor, stories that sounded impossible but were true. Landing under fire to extract surrounded units, flying multiple medevac missions in a single day. But the real genius of helicopter warfare in Vietnam wasn't the technology. It was the integration. Helicopters weren't just a new weapon. They were a new system. They changed how all other elements of combat were used. Artillery worked differently with helicopters. Forward observers flew in helicopters, could see the entire battlefield, could adjust fire in real time. The effectiveness of artillery increased dramatically. Airstrikes worked differently. Forward air controllers flew in small observation helicopters, could mark targets, could talk strike aircraft onto targets. Close air support became more responsive, more accurate, more deadly. Infantry tactics changed. Units could be inserted anywhere, extracted anywhere. Didn't have to walk everywhere. Could conduct raids deep into enemy territory, strike and extract before the enemy could respond. Command and control changed. Commanders flew in command helicopters, could see the battlefield personally, could make decisions based on direct observation. The speed of command increased. Logistics changed completely. Everything moved by helicopter, ammunition, food, water. If it needed to move, helicopters moved it. Ground convoys became rare in some areas, too vulnerable, too slow. Helicopters were faster and safer. Medical evacuation was revolutionized. The golden hour concept. Get wounded soldiers to surgery within 1 hour of being hit. Survival rates go up dramatically. Helicopters made this possible. The time from injury to surgery averaged 35 minutes. Unprecedented in military history. The psychological impact on American soldiers was profound. They knew help was always minutes away. If they got hit, dust-off would come. If they got surrounded, extraction helicopters would come. This created confidence, reduced fear. The psychological impact on the Viet Cong was equally profound, but opposite. Helicopters meant Americans could be anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. There was no safe rear area, no secure base camp, nowhere the helicopters couldn't reach. This created constant pressure, constant fear. The Viet Cong couldn't sleep during the day. Helicopters might attack, couldn't mass forces. Helicopters would detect them, couldn't move supplies during daylight. Helicopters would see them. Everything had to be dispersed. Hidden, underground, small units, constant movement. This degraded combat effectiveness. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 was the Viet Cong's attempt to change this dynamic. Mass attacks on cities, coordinated nationwide. The goal was to spark a general uprising, win the war politically, if not militarily. Helicopters were critical to the American response. When cities were attacked, helicopters moved troops between threatened points. When provincial capitals were surrounded, helicopters kept them supplied and reinforced. The Viet Cong expected Americans to be slow to respond. Instead, helicopters gave Americans instant mobility. The response was immediate, overwhelming, devastating. Tet was a tactical disaster for the Viet Cong. They suffered enormous casualties, lost most of their experienced cadre, were forced back into the countryside. Helicopters were a major reason why. They gave Americans the ability to respond faster than the Viet Cong could consolidate victories, to reinforce threatened points, to move forces where they were needed most. But Tet was also a strategic victory for North Vietnam. The American public saw the attacks on TV. The perception was that the war wasn't being won. Support for the war collapsed, the beginning of the end. The Huey continued flying missions for 7 more years. But the war was winding down. American combat troops were withdrawing. The helicopters were being turned over to the ARVN. The pilots were going home. By 1973, American combat operations were over. The helicopters were gone, except for a small number at the embassy. The war was now the South Vietnamese's to fight. April 1975. The end came fast. The NVA launched final offensives. The ARVN collapsed. The South Vietnamese government fell apart. In the final days, helicopters were critical one last time. but not for combat. For evacuation. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Hueys and Chinooks flew mission after mission, landing on rooftops, in parking lots, on the embassy grounds, loading as many people as possible. Way over capacity. But they flew anyway, because leaving people behind meant death. The iconic image. The helicopter on the rooftop, people climbing the ladder, that was a Huey. The same helicopter that had dominated Vietnam's skies for 14 years, now flying its last missions. Evacuation instead of assault. Defeat instead of victory. Over 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopter in 18 hours. The helicopters flew until they couldn't anymore. Some were pushed off aircraft carrier decks to make room for more incoming helicopters. Brand new Hueys, pushed into the ocean because there was no time and no room. The last helicopter lifted off from the embassy rooftop on April 30th, 1975. A Marine UH-1, carrying the last Americans out of Saigon. The war was over, and the Huey's war in Vietnam ended the same day. The statistics tell a story. Over 7,000 UH-1s served in Vietnam. They flew over 36 million sorties. They transported over 10 million soldiers, evacuated over 900,000 wounded. Those wounded statistics are important. 900,000 wounded soldiers flown to medical care. The survival rate was 97%, the highest in any war in history, because of helicopters. 5,086 helicopters were lost. That's a 72% loss rate. Nearly 3 out of 4 helicopters deployed to Vietnam were destroyed. Over 5,000 helicopter crew members were killed. The cost was enormous, but the impact was undeniable. Helicopters changed warfare. They proved that air mobility worked, that vertical envelopment was viable, that speed and mobility could overcome numbers and terrain. Every military in the world studied Vietnam helicopter operations. The Soviets developed their own air assault doctrines. The British, the French, everyone. The helicopter had proven itself as a revolutionary weapon system. The Huey itself became legendary. Over 16,000 were built. They served in over 100 countries. The design was so good that helicopters based on it are still in service today, over 60 years after the first flight. But it's the Vietnam War that defined the Huey. That's where it proved itself, where it became iconic. The whop-whop-whop of rotor blades is the sound of Vietnam. Ask any veteran, they'll tell you. That sound meant help was coming, or death was coming, depending on which side you were on. For Americans, the sound meant salvation, resupply, reinforcement, medevac, extraction, hope. That sound kept them fighting, kept them alive. For the Viet Cong, that sound meant terror. Incoming attack, fire from above, soldiers landing on your position, death from the sky. That sound forced them underground, forced them to fight a different war than they wanted. Nguyen Van Thanh, the Viet Cong fighter who watched that first Huey land in 1962, didn't survive to see the end. He was killed in 1965. Not in ground combat, from a helicopter gunship. He and his squad were moving between villages. They heard helicopters, started to scatter. Too late, the gunship saw them, dove, fired rockets. His squad was torn apart. Thanh was hit by shrapnel, died in the rice paddy. His last sight was a Huey banking overhead, still hunting, still killing. He'd laughed at the helicopters in 1962, thought they were fragile toys, thought the jungle would protect him. By 1965, he knew better, but knowing came too late. That was the story of the Viet Cong and the Huey. Initial contempt, growing respect, eventually fear. The learning curve was steep, and the price was paid in blood, Viet Cong blood mostly. But American blood too. Helicopter crews who died proving that air mobility worked, that helicopters could dominate the battlefield. The Americans who flew Hueys remember it differently. They remember the fear. Every landing was potential death. Every LZ could be hot. The stress was constant. The danger was real. Friends died. Helicopters crashed. But they kept flying. Because that's what needed to be done. Many have complicated feelings about the war, whether it was worth it, whether it accomplished anything. But they don't have complicated feelings about the Huey. That helicopter saved lives. It was a machine that mattered. Today, you can still hear Hueys flying, military bases, air shows, Forest Service firefighting. The distinctive sound hasn't changed. That whop-whop-whop is the same today as it was in 1962, as it was in 1975. Veterans hear that sound and they're back in Vietnam, just for a moment. The sound triggers memories, some good, some bad. Friends lost, battles fought, fear overcome, duty performed. The Huey was supposed to be a medical evacuation helicopter, a utility transport, nothing special. The Viet Cong looked at it in 1962 and laughed. Fragile, vulnerable, easy to shoot down, not a threat. They were catastrophically wrong. The Huey became the most important weapon system of the Vietnam War, not because it killed the most enemy, but because it changed everything about how the war was fought. It gave Americans mobility and speed that the Viet Cong couldn't counter. It turned the jungle from sanctuary into free fire zone. It made distance meaningless and terrain irrelevant. The Viet Cong stopped laughing pretty quickly. By 1965, they feared the Huey more than any other weapon, because the Huey meant Americans could be anywhere, anytime, with no warning except the sound of rotors. And by the time you heard that sound, it was already too late to run. The blades ruled the jungle, and the sky belonged to America. The Huey made sure of that, every day, every mission, for 14 years. Until the very last helicopter lifted off from Saigon and the war finally ended. But the lesson remained. Air mobility worked. Helicopters changed warfare forever. And the Viet Cong learned what every military since has learned. Never laugh at the helicopter. Because underestimating air power is a mistake you only make once. The Huey dominated the skies over Vietnam, but the North Vietnamese had their own aerial war to fight. When American F-105 Thunder Chiefs began bombing the North, Vietnamese pilots were told the massive fighter bombers were invincible. They laughed. How dangerous could one more be? If you want to know how that turned out, check out North Vietnamese pilots laughed at the F-105 Thunder Chief until it turned their skies into fire. And subscribe for more untold stories from the Vietnam War.